There is a place on Earth so remote that the nearest inhabited land is over 1,600 miles away. No continent watches over it. No neighboring island offers rescue. And yet, on this speck of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific, a group of people built something so massive, so strange, and so deliberate that it still defies easy explanation nearly 1,000 years later. Almost 1,000 stone giants stand, or once stood, staring out across an island that some of them never fully reached. Some rest finished at the shoreline. Others sit half-carved, still attached to the volcanic rock that birthed them, as if the sculptors simply put down their tools one day and walked away. No note, no warning, no clear ending. This is the story of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and it is not the story most people think they know. For decades, the popular version went like this: an isolated society, obsessed with building bigger and bigger statues, cut down every tree on the island, competing with each other for status, triggered an ecological collapse, descended into war and cannibalism, and was already a ruined civilization by the time Europeans arrived. It's a clean story. It's a cautionary tale. It has been repeated in books, documentaries, and classrooms for generations. It also may be substantially wrong. To understand why, we have to go back, past the myths, past the assumptions, to what the stone itself, the pollen in the soil, and the bones in the ground actually tell us. Rapa Nui was settled sometime between the years 1200 and 1300 of the Common Era, according to the most recent and most rigorously dated archaeological evidence, considerably later than earlier estimates that had pushed settlement back centuries further. The people who arrived were Polynesian voyagers, part of one of the greatest maritime expansion movements in human history, navigating open ocean in double-hulled canoes using stars, currents, and swells as their instruments. They didn't stumble onto this island by accident. They found it, deliberately, on a scale of exploration that dwarfs almost anything in the ancient world. What they built next has become one of archaeology's most recognizable achievements. The Moai, those famous stone figures, were not, as popular imagination often has it, simply heads. Excavations have shown that most Moai have full bodies, buried up to their shoulders over centuries by soil erosion and wind-blown sediment. Some stand over 30 feet tall and weigh more than 80 tons. They were carved almost exclusively from the volcanic tuff of a single quarry, Rapa, a crater that, to this day, holds nearly 400 Moai in every stage of completion, from barely sketched outlines to finished figures ready for transport. And that transport is where the real mystery lives. How do you move an 80-ton stone statue for miles, across uneven terrain, without wheels, without draft animals, without modern machinery? For years, the dominant theory assumed the islanders used log rollers, which would have required cutting down enormous numbers of trees. This fed directly into the collapse narrative: more Moai, more logs, more deforestation, more disaster. But in the past 2 decades, that explanation has been seriously challenged. Experimental archaeology, actual physical tests using replica Moai, has demonstrated something remarkable. With ropes attached at the head and sides, and a rhythmic side-to-side rocking motion, a small team can walk a Moai upright across open ground. Oral traditions on the island had said, for generations, that the statues walked to their platforms. Researchers had long dismissed this as folklore. The experiments suggest the islanders may have been describing, quite literally, exactly what happened. This single reversal, from dragged on logs to walked upright, undercuts one of the central pillars of the collapse theory. If Moai transport didn't require mass deforestation, then the story of a society destroying its own environment purely to move statues starts to fall apart. So what had happened to the island's trees? The forest that once covered Rapa Nui, dominated by a now extinct giant palm, did disappear, and that part of the record is not in dispute. But the cause has become one of the most contested questions in Pacific archaeology. Pollen records show the decline beginning not long after settlement. For years, this was read as proof of reckless overexploitation by the human population. More recent research, however, has pointed to an unexpected culprit working alongside, or even ahead of, human activity. The Polynesian rat, an invasive species that almost certainly arrived as a stowaway in the settlers' canoes. Rats have no natural predators on the island, breed rapidly, and are known, from studies elsewhere in the Pacific, to devastate palm seed populations by eating them before they can germinate. A forest that cannot reproduce is a forest with a slow, quiet death sentence. No war, no mass logging spree required. This doesn't mean human activity played no role. Clearing land for agriculture certainly contributed, but it reframes the story from reckless self-destruction to something more complicated. An ecosystem destabilized by the unintended consequences of long-distance voyaging itself, compounded by land-use decisions that, at the time, would have seemed entirely reasonable. And the human population? The old narrative held that Rapa Nui society peaked at over 10,000 people before collapsing catastrophically before Europeans ever set foot on the island. Newer analyses of the island's agricultural capacity, including its distinctive rock mulch gardening technique, which used broken volcanic stone to protect crops and retain moisture, suggest a more modest, more stable population, one that may never have spiked as dramatically as once assumed, and therefore never collapsed in the dramatic sense the old story requires. So if there was no self-inflicted apocalypse before European contact, why do the statues stop? Why are dozens left frozen mid-carving in the quarry, chisels essentially still in hand? This is where the record becomes genuinely uncertain, and where honest history has to sit with ambiguity rather than manufacture a tidy answer. Some researchers point to shifting religious and political structures on the island, a possible transition away from ancestor worship practices centered on Moai construction toward a new ritual system, the so-called Birdman competition, which emphasized athletic contests over monumental building. Under this view, the statues didn't stop because of disaster. They stopped because the culture that needed them evolved into something else. Other researchers argue that external contact, the arrival of European ships beginning in 1722, and the diseases, violence, and slave raids that followed in the 18th and 19th centuries, is the far more direct cause of the island's documented population crash. Peruvian slave raids in the 1860s alone are estimated to have removed roughly half of the island's remaining population, including much of its ruling and priestly class, the very people who would have held the specialized, generational knowledge of how the Moai were carved, moved, and erected. When that knowledge chain was severed, the tradition simply couldn't continue, regardless of the environment. Put plainly, the most recent evidence suggests it wasn't necessarily the islanders who destroyed their own civilization. It may have been the outside world that arrived just as they were transforming it themselves. This matters beyond academic debate. For over a century, Rapa Nui has been held up, in textbooks, in popular science writing, in casual conversation, as history's ultimate morality tale about environmental self-destruction. Do better, the story warns us, or end up like Easter Island. But if that story rests on shaky ground, then we've been telling ourselves a comforting fiction, that societies collapse through their own foolishness, rather than confronting a messier truth, one where climate, invasive species, colonial violence, and cultural change are tangled together in ways that resist a single, satisfying lesson. Walk among the Moai today, and you can, since roughly half of them still stand or lie in some recognizable form across the island. And what you see is not a graveyard of ambition. It's a landscape frozen mid-sentence, a quarry full of statues in every stage of birth, a shoreline of finished figures, most facing inland toward where villages once stood, as if still watching over descendants who, remarkably, never entirely disappeared. Rapa Nui's people were not erased. Their descendants live on the island today, and in recent decades have taken an increasingly central role in researching, protecting, and reinterpreting their own history, pushing back against outside narratives that reduce their ancestors to a cautionary tale rather than a civilization of navigators, engineers, and artists. The statues were never meant to be a warning. They were meant to be guardians. And in a strange, unplanned way, they still are, not warning us about ecological ruin, but reminding us how easily a complicated, resilient history can be flattened into a simple story if no one is left with the standing to correct it. Reino Raraku's half-finished giants are still there, exactly where their carvers left them centuries ago. Not monuments to failure, monuments to a story we are only now, finally, learning how to read correctly.